Good day, everyone. My name is Caitlin Erb, and I thank you for tuning into my presentation titled An Investigation into the Relationship Between Culturally Responsive Teaching Perceptions and Experiences of Suburban Educators, an Explanatory Sequential Mixed Method Study. I begin this presentation by addressing the problem discussed in the study, grounding it in a review of pre-existing literature, explaining the purpose of the study, and discussing the research questions. Next, I provide the theoretical framework and methodology used to structure the study. Then, I review an overview of the findings. Finally, I discuss the implications, provide recommendations for educational collaborators, mention the limitations of the study, and address my distribution plan. The final slide lists the sources referenced throughout my presentation. For the purpose of the study, marginalized students are defined as a student who is excluded or mistreated based on their social identities such as race, gender, sexuality, and social class. Insufficient teacher preparation, ineffective instructional methods, and cultural biases contribute to the misuse of culturally responsive practices, which impacts the ever-present educational opportunity gap. These extensive issues are often related to the struggles teachers experience around serving marginalized students. When schools do not address these issues, marginalized students who feel isolated in their education continue to become disengaged and experience significant problems. These problems include a lack of attentiveness, eagerness, independence, persistence, organization, and flexibility, all skills necessary to be a productive member of society. In addition, students who feel secluded become disillusioned and experience academic difficulties, ultimately leading to an educational opportunity gap between marginalized students and their non-marginalized peers. Despite the increasing enrollment of marginalized students within suburban school districts, the academic opportunity gap remains persistent due to the educators' perceived preparation deficiencies and lack of support for culturally responsive teaching practices. This problem led me to research staff preparation, pedagogical practices, and community as they relate to culturally responsive teaching and the success of marginalized students. When I explored research related to staff preparation, it became clear that a teacher's preparation program and professional development impacted a teacher's use of culturally responsive practices and significantly influenced the opportunity gap experienced by marginalized students. Effective programs and professional development focused on developing reflective practices, collaboration with diverse communities, critical thinking skills, and understanding multiple perspectives, ultimately enabling teachers to meet marginalized students' needs. However, some pre-service teachers felt that their programs inadequately prepared them for this task. Reflecting on staff preparation led to an in-depth exploration of pedagogical practices, including funds of knowledge, cultural values, and instructional practices. Supporting marginalized student success in education often involved teachers employing pedagogical practices tailored to a student's personal needs, including their cultural values and funds of knowledge. Researchers also highlighted the effectiveness of cultural-based instructional practices, such as small groups, projects, and literature discussions. Ultimately, these supported marginalized students' inclusions and academic achievement. Research also determined that a third factor related to student success was community. This topic includes school culture, teacher support, relationships, and deficit-based beliefs. Marginalized students benefit from a supportive school environment that embraces their racial ethnic identities, fosters identity exploration, and promotes academic success through culturally responsive practices. School communities lacking effective culturally responsive practices often operated in a deficit belief towards marginalized students, contributing to the environment where students faced barriers such as stereotyping and cultural biases. Peer relationships also suffered as initial curiosity about marginalized classmates' cultures often led to assumptions and biases when not properly supported by teachers. The research drove me to develop the purpose of this explanatory sequential mixed method study, which was to examine predictive relationships between teachers' culturally responsive preparedness and practice levels. To achieve this purpose, I developed 3 research questions focused on the 3 components of a mixed method study. The quantitative question asked, are culturally responsive factors statistically significant predictors of a multicultural teaching environment? This question was followed up by the quantitative question, how do teacher experiences describe integrating cultural responsive practices in the classroom? The final question, which was mixed methods, asked, how do teacher interviews support their quantitative responses related to their culturally responsive practices? I grounded my study in Gay's culturally responsive teaching framework, developed in the early 2000s and based on the foundational research of Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy. Gay's work focused on creating a culturally responsive learning environment and stated that educators must create a classroom environment that supports each student's culture and thus their academic opportunities. The concept focuses on 5 essential components. Developing a culturally diverse knowledge base includes expanding on a deep understanding of different groups' cultural characteristics, needs, and contributions, and using that knowledge to make schooling more exciting and personalized. Designing culturally relevant curricula requires that teachers utilize cultural practices that support marginalized learners. Gay defines demonstrating cultural caring and building a learning community as factors used when creating a welcoming classroom environment that utilizes cultural scaffolding, builds positive relationships, and expects high levels of success from all students. Gay's cross-cultural communications states that teachers must understand culturally encoded language and be open to accepting all communication styles without linguistic bias to provide students with academic opportunities. The final component of GAZE culturally responsive teaching focuses on creating and using cultural congruity in all classroom instruction to diversify teaching methods and learning strategies to meet all students' cultural needs. I selected the explanatory sequential design for this study as it allowed me to identify and explain quantitative differences in teachers' culturally responsive preparedness and practice levels at a suburban high school in New Jersey. The quantitative phase allowed me to explore the relationships between culturally responsive teaching preparation and instructional strategies by analyzing quantitative tests based on numerical data. In this phase, I surveyed 60 participants employed as full-time educators at the high school during the 2023-2024 school year, and ultimately I determined their perceived understanding of and abilities related to culturally responsive teaching. The qualitative phase began when I conducted qualitative interviews to explore specific classroom experiences. Here, I interviewed 4 participants who agreed to participate in the interview, were members of the STEM or humanities programs, and had at least 5 years of teaching experience. I explored teachers' lived experiences relating to their preparation and the delivery of culturally responsive instructional methods this way. By integrating each set of results to generalized teacher experiences in this suburban high school, I could explain the impact of instructional methods and practices on creating culturally responsive teachers. The study quantitatively demonstrated the statistical significance of all 3 independent variables as predictors of a multicultural teaching environment. The independent variables emerged as statistically significant predictors of a multicultural teaching environment as evidenced by an overall significant model as it was a better fit than the mean of outcome variables. Of the 3 factors, group belonging was heavily reliant upon. Participants also reported that their experiences highlighted these quantitative findings qualitatively. The interviews indicated that the teachers' utilization of all 3 cultural responsive factors correlated with their experiences during their pre-service program, classroom settings, and community sport, and emphasized the importance of group belonging. The qualitative data enriched the quantitative findings and offered more profound insight into the current educators' lived experiences in a homogeneous classroom in a suburban setting. It led to an understanding of how teacher practices support their quantitative responses. Integrating both data sets also increased my understanding of the complex dynamics surrounding culturally responsive teaching environments. The quantitative analysis revealed that the formation of group belonging is the best predictor of a culturally responsive classroom with a standardized beta coefficient of 0.473, and curriculum and instruction is the poorest predictor with a standardized beta coefficient of 0.118. I corroborated this statistical observation through the insights derived from the teacher interviews, which indicated the significance of cultivating a supportive classroom environment characterized by positive and authentic interactions. These interactions fostered a sense of group belonging, which both the quantitative and qualitative results demonstrated as crucial for all students' academic success. Moreover, the interviews and survey underscored the importance of nurturing positive teacher-student relationships by emphasizing the necessity of acceptance and support. Participants also acknowledged the importance of specific instructional activities such as group work and mandated curriculum standards through the interview and survey. In addition to investigating GAY's culturally responsive teaching framework, I identified an emergent theme, exposure to diversity. Although the 4 interview participants shared varied experiences regarding their access to diverse populations during their pre-service teacher training, the extent and nature of this exposure did ultimately influence their comfort levels and comprehension of culturally responsive teaching practices. This lack of exposure leads to fears of othering, which stagnates marginalized student support. I also determined that the absence of educational community support due to limited exposure to diversity on their part and that of the teacher impacted the effective use of culturally responsive practices. However, more research is needed to determine its true impact. After finalizing my research and inspecting the data, I could identify connections to the literature I deeply explored early in this journey. Previous studies extensively explored the negative pre-service teachers' perceptions of their teacher preparation programs and how these programs influence their ability to meet the needs of marginalized students. My study, too, reviewed these perceptions and found similar results. The literature review also found effective instructional practices that supported the academic success of marginalized students, often involved incorporating their cultural values and funds of knowledge. The results of my study indicated that only 17% of participants felt fully prepared to meet the needs of marginalized students through curriculum and instruction. Previous research also found that the success of marginalized students relied on having a supportive school culture and strong teacher support that went beyond the classroom. 75% of participants felt prepared to meet the needs of marginalized students as they formed group belonging, and 50% of participants scored themselves as highly to completely confident in their ability to use knowledge of their students' cultural backgrounds to create a welcoming learning environment. These descriptive statistics supported the inferential results, which determined that group belonging was a better predictor than the other 2 factors, but that all 3 factors were significant predictors of a multicultural teaching environment. It was also clear that the majority of staff members did not perceive themselves as culturally responsive teachers, even though most were in fact using culturally responsive practices. Multiple studies emphasize the positive impact of integrating students' cultural values into classroom practices, fostering a sense of belonging and academic interest. Both previous research and my study affirm that acknowledging cultural values enhances student engagement and confidence while combating discrimination within schools. Teacher support is identified as crucial for empowering marginalized students and creating an inclusive, respectful school culture. Interviews with educators and my findings ultimately highlight the pivotal role of culturally responsive teaching practices in nurturing students' identities and adapting teaching methods to diverse needs. Previous research and my study underscore the effectiveness of culture-based instructional strategies such as debates and literature sharing in promoting cross-cultural understanding and student success. Despite challenges, including deficits in culturally responsive practices and ineffective pre-service preparation programs, educators are committing to creating supportive environments where students can explore their identities and engage in meaningful discourse. However, systemic issues such as stereotyping and bias persist within educational communities, highlighting the need for a comprehensive reform to ensure equitable opportunities for all students. By reviewing the study, educators and administrators can learn to work together to assess the gaps that pre-service programs left in preparing educators to meet the cultural needs of their students. I recommend that by working together, educators and administrators create time for educational staff to research effective culturally responsive teaching strategies and community support, critically examine the current situation within their schools and the needs of their marginalized populations, and self-reflect on how their personal experience are helping or hindering the success of marginalized students. District policymakers can use the results of this study to understand the crucial role they play in formulating symbiotic and equitable relationships within the school system, which ultimately supports the learning and development of all students. This allows policymakers to self-reflect on the current state of their district and update regulations to mitigate discriminatory practices. Pre-service educational programs can reflect on how this research underscores the sentiment of most educators that their pre-service programs inadequately equip them to meet the need of diverse students and marginalized populations. I recommend that each program critically assess its structure from top to bottom to determine areas where they need to support the growth of students through culturally responsive learning. Although researchers do not consistently interact with future or current educators, they often impact policies and practices regarding how and what educators learn and practice. Because of this, researchers have the power to use the study to cooperate existing research related to culturally responsive teaching, thus giving it more power. Future research should also explore the impact of exposure to diversity on a teacher's use of and confidence in culturally responsive teaching, as well as the disjunct between a teacher's perceived level of confidence and their actual utilization of culturally responsive practices. This study encountered 3 pertinent limitations. Due to time constraints, I could only collect and analyze data for 5 months. This limit was dictated by the parameters of the doctoral program and the school district's academic calendar year. This time constraint also resulted in a modest quantitative sample size of 60 participants, ultimately preventing me from generalizing the results to a broader population. During the qualitative phase, I was also limited by people who responded and provided me with a sample of only 2 teachers from the STEM program and 2 from the humanities department. I was also restricted to surveying and interviewing teachers regarding the academic success of marginalized students, as the district denied me access to student perspectives. This refusal was due to constraints within the legal precedents of the district. In order to disseminate my study and its finding to educators and administrators, I plan to provide professional development workshops that model effective culturally responsive practices and support educators as they build their confidence in using them in my district. In addition, I will work on becoming a professional consultant to take these professional development programs to other districts to support marginalized students throughout the public education sector. I also plan to attend Board of Education meetings to present the findings of my studies in hope of suggesting policy development strategies that positively impact marginalized students and increase culturally responsive practices. At these Board of Education meetings, I will offer pamphlets about culturally responsive teaching and its usage in the classroom to community members to dispel incorrect information and increase support for this method of instruction. The best way to share my study and its findings with pre-service education programs is to become a pre-service educator myself. I hope to obtain a full-time professor position where I can work with colleagues to make effective curriculum changes that include more instruction using culturally responsive practices and update the current student teaching and practicum programs. I will also coordinate with faculty members across departments to update course material to reflect culturally responsive teaching practices. Sharing my study with researchers requires attending academic conferences on diversity with organizations such as NAME and the AAC&U. I also plan to publish my findings in ProQuest for future educators to explore. I plan to continue researching this topic to increase my understanding of culturally responsive teaching, marginalized students' needs, and diversity and inclusion. References. Additional references. I want to take this time to thank the committee, and I look forward to engaging in a deep and meaningful conversation about the relationship between culturally responsive teaching perceptions and the experiences of suburban educators.